Hello and welcome back to Blighback Hobbies. I hope you're all having a fun and festive time. In this episode I'm going to show you how to get results like these on all 4 miniatures in just over 5 hours without having to rely on new fandangled out there techniques or just slapping a load of contrast paint on. Insert stock Christmas joke containing stuffing crackers and candy canes now. Matron. I've decided to use a variation on one of the official colour schemes for the Stormcast Eternals. This is the Sons of the Storm, which is a nice sort of Stormtrooper white armour with teal and gold and a little bit of maroon on there. It won't be exactly the same. I'm going to vary up a little bit and maybe change 1 or 2 of the colours. We'll see how it pans out. Before we crack on, I'd like to thank you for joining us again. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, like and share. It really does help me out a great deal. This being Christmas, we're getting a little bit of double bubble as I'm testing out P3 paints for the first time. Now, I've heard that these are nice and thin and that they're extremely highly pigmented. Ideal for glazes, which is the technique that we're going to be concentrating on today. However, I have got some glaze medium from Vallejo just in case they do need thinning out ever so slightly. We'll start off with the flesh tone. I'll put a tiny bit of glaze medium in and then I've tested it on my nail and as you'll see it shrinks. So I've had to thicken it back up again. Looks like I'm not going to need anywhere near as much glaze medium as I thought. These paints really are nice and thin. In this particular case I've only got 2 characters that have actually got any flesh exposed and it's both on the faces, so this should be a nice, easy, simple step. I'll begin by applying nice thin light layers. Anyone who's watched the channel before may have already noticed that these miniatures have been primed with a multicoloured zenithal highlight, beginning with a blue grey base tone, followed by a light pale blue as the mid-tone, and then finally a white as the peak of the zenith. This is a key element in the time-saving aspect of this particular technique, as this forms the basis of the entire paint job. Then we glaze over the top of it by thinly layering up these highly pigmented paints. This acts as a way of tinting that first priming rather than covering it up. Not only does this aid creating mood and lighting, but it is the key to the speed of the paint job, as the first layers are practically done with the undercoat. And if you want to know how to achieve this first step, I'll put a link to my tutorial video on it in the description. One of the first things that people should notice about these minis when viewing them on the table is that they've got lovely flowing cloaks. And we're going to take that teal from the Sons of the Storm paint scheme and use it for these. It's one of my favourite colours this. It should make them both stand out and blend nicely with that blue-grey underpainting that we've started with. In order to keep a more smooth surface on the mini, and the cloak in particular, it's a good idea to try and keep your brush strokes flowing in the same direction and just sort of lick the surface gently with the brush. As you can see, I am still testing the opacity and the viscosity of the paint on my nail, just to make sure that it's not either too thick or too thin like it was earlier when it started to shrink. That's generally speaking what happens when your paint's too thin. The surface tension makes the paint shrink, and when it's too thick, obviously you won't be able to see your nail through it. So it is a good idea to check this every now and then just to make sure before you put the paint on the mini. This is a particularly nice miniature out of this set as it's carrying a lantern, and I've chosen to use what they call object source lighting, or OSL, as part of the priming at the beginning. And in English, all this basically means is that you're creating the illusion of an extra source of light emanating from a specific object on the miniature, hence object source lighting. So in this case it's the lantern, and it's spread nicely to the front of the miniature but not too much, so that when it is covered up by the rest of the paint job it should diminish its effects ever so slightly without taking away that nice yellow glow. In future I may choose to do a short tutorial video on how to achieve this technique as well. Just let me know if you'd like that in the comments below. Here you might notice that I'm not actually touching the raised areas on the folds of the cloak. This is because I don't want to taint the pure yellow of that lantern light. However, the areas where I am touching it, because the paint is so nice and thin, it'll just ever so slightly tint it green, as if the colours are blending, and then into the teal of the actual cloak, so it should create a nice effect. This video is in part a miniature rescue video of sorts. What I usually do, particularly with Stormcast Eternal, because they're available in abundance secondhand on eBay, probably because, like their cousins, the Space Marines or the Astartes, if you'd rather, they're in every single box set. So there's a lot of these guys and girls floating round, which is good news for anybody who wants to pick them up at a reasonable price. And you might have to do a little bit of paint stripping. I particularly really like these miniatures. They're nice and easy to paint. They're good to kit bash. I know that some of the earlier models weren't popular with everybody, but I actually don't mind some of the chunkier guys. I really like the new molds as well. The slim down designs are very, very nice, but like I say, I don't mind these chunky guys. Speaking of which, this chunky guy that I'm painting up right now, I did notice a little bit of battle damage, which is probably a little bit of spilled glue on the back of his cloak that somebody may have spilt when they were putting this particular mini together, which is unfortunate, but you do have to deal with these things every now and then. Now moving on to the bird. Bird. The bird is your word. I am keen to retain a little bit of uniformity with the paint schemes. I've decided to do every other feather with a little teal. This is some Reichland Flesh Shade, and I'm just using this to bring out the shadows and deepen them a little bit more on both of the miniatures. We're not saturating it, we're literally putting it into the recesses only where it's needed. Here we'll double check that colour scheme again and see what his next step should be. And I think we're going to tackle that gold. Now, despite what I said in the introduction about not relying on contrast paints, it doesn't mean that we're not going to use any at all, as they are very good for glazes, particularly when they're thinned down. And there are some really nice technical contrast paints and speed paints out there. This particular one is Hoplite Gold, or Hoplites Gold, to pronounce it more correctly. It's an Army Painter speed paint, and it's a very nice and very unusual speed paint, as they're not usually available in metallics. However, I have found this particular one very nice for this kind of glazing, and then you can highlight above it with normal metallics as and when you need to. Don't worry too much about the fact that this gold looks a little bit desaturated. We are going to spruce it up with a few inks and some highlights afterwards anyway, so at the minute it might appear a little bit dull and dark, but we will fix that later on. So far I do like the way that these are coming together already. Let's continue. As stated at the beginning of the video, I've decided to alter one of the accent colours from a deep maroon to a sort of magenta, pinky purple instead. I think this will contrast very nicely with that teal and just make it a little more bright. Besides all that, I genuinely like pink. And here's some evidence from the times when I used to have hair on days other than those with full moons. I'm going to make sure that there's a little bit of this pink on every single miniature. Again, we're going for uniformity, and some of the areas on these miniatures would lend themselves really well to standing out and being pink, like the handle on this great hammer, and I believe I'll do it with the scabbard on the leader, as it should break up the focal point from that nice yellow lantern glow. And for this reason I also decided to do the chainmail down the front of this miniature as well. However, there will not be any pink going on the bird. Bird. The bird is your word. What we're going to do instead is we're going to start to add some detail in the recesses of the feathers and a little bit of the mottling at the front with some of that Reichland Flesh Shade, then on the tail feathers as well. These are going to be very light strokes. Again, as with the entire paint job, we're merely accenting, we're not painting over as such with the majority of colours. And seeing as we're already working with the Reichland Flesh shade, we're going to be economic with this time. We're going to use it to start enriching the recesses of that gold. This will give it a more warm feel. We'll follow this in a uniform manner on each miniature for each gold section. And that's pretty much what you're going to have to do if you are sort of factory line painting, as it were, which is what you usually do with small squads and army painting. It's not my favourite thing in the world, but it's a necessary evil. I much prefer to paint single miniatures, if I'm honest. Still, it's really satisfying when you've got a complete squad, even if it's only 4 minis like this one, and you can get it on table ready to play. Then sticking with that Reichland Flesh shade, we're back to putting a little bit of colour on the tree stump that the bird
the bird is a word,
is either resting on or landing on. And then we're going to move on to one of the other glaze type paints. Well, they're not glaze type paints, they're just thin paints with a very high pigmentation to them, so they glaze really well, that's all. They're not designed for glazes, I don't think. But we're going to start with a sort of greeny brown one and start filling some of the leather elements on 1 or 2 of the miniatures, and put a little bit of variation into the brown of the wood bark for that piece of scenery. And as you've probably already noticed, I have started to use a little bit of this sort of green brown to fill in the beginnings of the grass on some of the scenic bases. But much like the wood bark, this is only the beginning. We will be using a variety of different colours to kind of get a nice mixed natural looking effect for those. The first of those is going to be a little bit of a Thonian camo shade, if I'm pronouncing that properly. A lot of the names for the Games Workshop paints are good in one way because they're for specific models, but on the other hand, they're a little bit enigmatic in if you're looking for specific colours. I'm going to spread this around all the bases on the grassy areas. I don't have to cover it all because, like I said before, I'm going to be mixing it with a few different shades and a few different colours to get a sort of more natural looking effect. Next up is some Agrax Earth shade, which is another pronunciation friendly pot. Basically means brown ink. And we're going to do much the same with that one all over the areas that are leather and bark. And a little bit for the rope around the back of the leader's belt. Should work for just about every little bit that we need. Time to enriching that pink a little bit with some pure red Vallejo ink, and we're going to do much the same as you do with any other wash or ink. It's just going to go into specific areas. We're not saturating the entire area with it. We're going to apply it into the recesses as and where we can, and it's just going to deepen that pink and make it a little bit less Barbie pink. As you can see here, I'm just using it to touch the back of each of these scales, and I'm avoiding the edges. We'll start bringing out the gold now with greedy gold from the army painter. This is going to serve as a first highlight and just to sort of clean up the main body of anywhere that's become a little too oversaturated with that Reichland Flesh shade. Just the raised areas. We don't want to cover it up altogether, and it just makes the gold pop ever so slightly more. Each of these miniatures in this set does have a slight variation on where you might want to place different colours. For example, the little lightning bolts on this guy's belt, and obviously the bow and quiver on the last miniature that I painted, and obviously the lantern on the leader. So you've got a few options to spread your different accent colours around, which is nice. And don't forget, because this is basically a zenithal highlight paint scheme, when you are highlighting, you only need to follow the areas of light, like on this shoulder pad, that are actually being caught. So around the back here, I'm going to be highlighting very little because it's in shadow, it's in shade, it doesn't need it. And this in turn will not only make your miniatures look a little bit more dramatic with more dynamic lighting, but it will save you a hell of a lot of time. And then we will finish off the gold highlights with a shining gold, which is another Army Painter metallic. The Army Painter metallics have really come on recently. They're a very, very nice set. And we cover even less of the miniature with this because it's literally just a top highlight to pick out the edges. Time for one of my favourite contrast paints now, and that is Plague Bearer Flesh. I absolutely love this. It's very versatile and it's an extremely good colour. We're going to use this for the base, a little bit of moss on the tree where the bird
Bad. The bird is a word.
is landing or sitting or perched. I don't know, is it landing or is it taking off? You decide. And we're going to go around the moss and grass or whatever it is on those bases as well. Time to make a start on the armour now, and I've made another executive decision that despite the fact the original colour scheme is a white, almost stormtrooper-y type of armour, I don't want it to appear exactly like Stormtroopers, so I've decided to make it a little bit more grey for a couple of reasons. One, for the aforementioned, and two, because these miniatures are supposed to be in slightly low light, I want that white armour to appear a little bit more dull and pop more at the edges of the highlights. This will also save time, and this is a speed paint session, so that's what we want. And it shouldn't diminish the effect that they're only white where the light hits it, which is the point. I'll start with some very precise strokes on the edges, and then I'll start scoring out in an omnidirectional pattern on certain areas where I want the light to appear that it's creeping a little bit more. Using the same direction for my brush strokes intentionally helps to give a smooth effect for your paints, and especially on things like armour, you don't want them to appear jaggedy unless you're putting chinks and battle damage and things like that in. But for now, I'd prefer personally to keep it smooth, and then if you want, it's an option to put battle damage and things like that on it afterwards. The leader miniature in particular, she has got a name. I should learn it if I'm honest, but for now we'll just refer to her as the leader. Has got a very nice sort of dynamic pose with this lantern, and it should make this particular way of painting effective for making the light creep round. You can see we're just looking at where the light's going to come mainly from the bleed off from that lantern, and we're highlighting the very edges of every raised surface, catching that little bit of light. Don't have to go overboard, and we certainly don't have to do every single edge if it's not being illuminated by that lantern or any other imagined light source being created with that zenith. Apologies for the quality of my voiceover on this episode. At time of recording, I seem to have been struck with Nurgle's dreaded man plague, and it's affecting my voice a little. Apologies. I'll begin the highlights on the cloak with a little bit of AK's 3rd gen pastel range. The pastel range is a personal favourite, and the blues and the pinks and the yellow in particular are very nice. So we've got the blue here, so we can start doing the teal with the first mid-tone highlight, and we're just doing exactly the same as we did with that white. We're following the pattern of light created by the zenithal highlight, and obviously on the leader miniature, that lantern as well, and we're just going to create some mid-tone highlights. In this style of painting, sometimes it's easy to be a little bit afraid of lighter or more high contrast between your highlights and your base coats. But if you keep them to a minimum, it shouldn't break the effect that you're after. You've also got to bear in mind that a lot of paints will actually dry ever so slightly darker than they are when they go on. So it's not something to be scared of. I must admit, I am really enjoying painting this miniature in particular. Everything seems to be coming together just nicely, and I'm enjoying blending this pastel blue in with the white highlights that I did earlier. It's going to be very nice. I'd start with a little bit of army paint of gunmetal to bring out some of the metal parts. There won't be very many of these on this particular set of miniatures. There's obviously going to be the warhammer and the arrow tips, things like that. Then afterwards we'll highlight with a slightly lighter metal after giving it a little bit of a null oil wash in the recesses. There's a little bit of skeleton horde here, and we're going to use this to put a little bit more detail on the bird.
Bad. The bird is a word.
We're just varying the shadows and shades. We're not going to cover everything that we covered before, otherwise it'll cover up what we used with the Reichland Flesh Shade. Just literally for variety. Now we're doing the aforementioned null oil shade on the metal elements, and this will be quickly followed up with a shining silver, I believe I'm going to use, another army painted metallic for highlights on the metal areas. But while we've got the null oil out, we might as well start putting the shadows into the recesses on our brickwork on the bases. Painting up bases like this, particularly scenic ones, is one of the few times where I personally go a little bit more liberally with the paint application. I want to saturate it, make it look dirty, and we're going to be mixing different types of paint to give a kind of more natural effect anyway, so they're not going to stay looking exactly the way that they do right now. So just slap it on. As you can gather here, I'm just doing 1 or 2 extra pure white highlights just to pick out the edges on the armour, and also do the same on the cloaks. Just at the tips, very sparingly. We don't want to go over the highlights we've already done. We're just making those edges at the peak of the light stand out a little bit better. Going to use another very versatile and great paint from Games Workshop. This is Lilac Oxide. It's supposed to look like sort of oxidized copper or little bits of rust, things like that. It is good for that, for actual rust, but I like to use it for discoloration on rocks and bases and things like that. I generally use it a little bit more sparingly and just almost randomly to create that kind of extra effect. Got a nice thick yellow ink, another Vallejo one here, and we're using this on some of the last parts of the bird.
Bad. The bird is a word.
For the beak and the claws, well, talons. I'm not thinning this down at all, I'm just carefully applying it in several thin layers. So we're going on to the last highlight, that shining silver that I mentioned earlier for the metallics. This will be a very quick section, literally just picking out several small edges just so that it breaks up that area ever so slightly. As with any of these highlights, you have got the choice, if this was going to be a longer paint job, of going a little bit further, making them a little bit more highly contrasted to make them stand out a little bit more. But because this is a speed paint session, we're going to keep it to the bare minimum to make it look better than tabletop quality, but not quite onto your showpiece quality. We'll take a light grey now, called Ghoul Grey, which is an army painter paint, and a very nice one. And we're going to dry brush it onto several things, including the bird.
Bad. The bird is a word.
And the stonework on the bases. We are getting somewhere towards the end now. Just one more light dry brush of beige onto the tree stump, on which sits the bird.
Bird. The bird is a word.
If you or anybody you know have been affected by what you've seen in this program, feel free to call the Smurshans on 01163 6969666. Please remember, don't suffer alone.
Onto the final touches now, and we're going to do the rims of all of the bases with a nice deep red brown, and then I'm going to put some hard coat, which is basically a hard varnish, on some of the areas that I want to shine a little bit more. So it'll be things like the armour and the shoulder pads, things like that, and then we should be just about done. So we're just about there. Let's have a quick look at them finally, see if they need anything else doing to them. And here obviously we have the hawk, just about there on that one I think. Then there's the archer, she's looking nice. The big bruiser, and finally my favourite out of this lot is the leader with a lantern. As I mentioned before, these were a miniature rescue. They'd previously been paint stripped, and unfortunately they didn't come off completely unscathed, as I mentioned with this miniature earlier. You can see on the back here where this looks like glue that's been dripped, and it unfortunately has damaged the miniature. So I could, if I'd have spotted this in time, filed that off, but unfortunately this was a speed run and I was just in a little bit too much of a rush to notice it, unfortunately. Just over 5 hours, including the zenith at the beginning, which took me about say 5-10 minutes. I think they've turned out pretty nicely despite the blemish on that nice big chunky fella. So let's have a proper look at them once and for all.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.